Hello. I don't know why I'm leaning in. We've got two mics, I don't need to. Hi, my name is Jane Bradley and I'm a journalist at the New York Times. More importantly, this is Oliver Bullough, who is an award-winning investigative journalist and author whose latest book, called A Butler to the World, is basically about how Britain has made its fortune from the money of kleptocrats, oligarchs and other dodgy people. Everyone keeps saying your book's very timely. And that's obviously because with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the global sanctions that followed, I think it's really stark and horrific, the direct link between oligarchs' money and the propping up of autocratic regimes. But I think the timely comment is kind of missing the mark a bit, because Oliver has been banging on about for ages, I don't want to give away your age, but for a long time, about how much of a problem illicit wealth is in the UK and how the authorities have been failing to do anything for many, many years, and how this goes for all years, even longer. So without further ado, I just want to start by asking how you came to the flattering conclusion that Britain was a butler to the world.
Yeah, it's funny what you say about the timely nature of the book. I got a lot of reviews saying it was timely but depressing, which I felt I might put on my gravestone when I finally move on. It's when we were talking with my publishers about promoting the book in the autumn, there's a long chapter about Gibraltar and how Gibraltar was transformed from a naval base into a big centre of offshore gambling, the big centre of offshore gambling, you know, a centre to rival Macau and Las Vegas in terms of its significance for global gambling, totally unnoticed in the UK. And I thought, well, that's the chapter that will make a big splash. And then because of what's happened in Ukraine, no one's even noticed, which is kind of, you know, obviously the significance of what's happening in Ukraine, but it's to say that this is a book that is about significantly more than just Russian oligarchs or indeed oligarchs, because Britain has been essentially open for laundering, hiding, moving wealth of any kind of origin for anyone for about 60 or 70 years. It's basically our sort of post-imperial role in the world. And I'm a Russianist, so I worked in Russia for many years, mainly for Reuters in Moscow, but also for various other people. And if you spend any time in Russia, you become increasingly clear that you can't understand the country without understanding corruption. You know, corruption, initially you come across it just as sort of being shaken down on the street by police officers, or being shaken down in an airport by a border guard, or having to pay a bribe to see a doctor or whatever. It's, you know, it's that kind of retail level. But then the more you look into how corruption works, the more you realise that that's just the foot soldiers of the structure, that you end up with a far more complicated and sophisticated pyramid of corruption going all the way up to the top. So each bribe taken by a foot soldier of corruption, a little bit flows upwards, and by the time it's reaching Mr. Putin or his ministers at the top, you're talking about a huge quantity of money going to the top. And then it doesn't take long looking into corruption and looking into where the money goes, where Putin and his ministers put their money, to realise that you can't understand it as a Russian phenomenon, because the money doesn't stay in Russia. It comes here. Not only here, but let's face it, mainly here, or historically mainly here, until February anyway. And so that's why I became so interested in trying to talk about Britain's role in laundering money, because, you know, it would be impossible to solve corruption in the global south or wherever without solving the problem here, and that gets far too little attention. And I suppose in terms of the primary nature of Britain, I mean, I wrote about it as a global phenomenon. We're talking about the role of the US, the role of France and Spain and lots of places, but the role of Britain as a primary actor in this sort of enabling industry, it derives from just this one conversation which I was having with an American academic, because with some friends, we run something called the kleptocracy tours, when we put people in a bus and show properties that belong to oligarchs, mainly in West London, but you can go anywhere. North London, there's lots as well. Obviously the home counties, if the traffic is easy enough. You know, it's a target-rich environment. And so I'm often associated with kleptocracy in London. If you Google kleptocracy in London, I'm you know, near the top of the list of people who come up, I suppose. So this American academic who was coming to look into Chinese money laundering asked me out for a coffee because he wanted some contacts for people in positions of power he could talk to. And it's funny, I was just talking to Jane about this, a very similar conversations with American colleagues, he kept asking me who was the equivalent of an American. So who's the equivalent of a prosecutor from the Southern District of New York? And I'd have to say we don't have that. And who's the equivalent of the Department of Justice's kleptocracy program? And so, well, yeah, don't have that either. You know, who's the equivalent of the Homeland Security Investigations High Net Worth Individual Investigation Squad? yeah, we don't have that. And so it goes on basically until eventually I had to say, look, you can keep asking for these things. You can keep trying. It's like he kept trying to think of equivalents. You know, who's the equivalent of the FBI's whatever? It's like no, and you can keep asking until the rocks rock away. You're never going to find these people because they don't exist. And I said, well, you know, because America, you see yourself as a policeman to the world. You investigate these crimes, but we don't. And I was like, what are we? You know, what is Britain? What's Britain's role as this place where the money goes, the money moves, the money ends up, the money gets hidden and protected, and so on. And I thought, we're the butler. That's what we are. We're the butler. So America's the policeman. We're the butler. And then, I mean, he was a bit, I think, cross with me because I think he was hoping I'd give him some contacts. So the conversation ended quite quickly. But actually, it struck me as an interesting way of looking at it. Really.
I'm glad you raised that meeting with the American academic, because that really stood out for me as a journalist who, British, but has worked with Americans for a very long time. The fact that, to your point, that in the US, court records and documents, there's a lot more transparency around there, and also officials are a lot more willing to talk to journalists. Why do you think that there is that difference in culture in the US compared to the UK? And do you have any tips for journalists who might want to try and investigate financial crime?
It's really interesting. I think it's one of the reasons why Brits like writing about America so much. I mean, it is intrinsically a fascinating place. Obviously, it's a huge and wonderful country. Also, it's really easy to write about. I mean, you can go. I remember going. I went to Miami on spec, and I got there, and I was in a cafe, and I googled some people to talk to, and there was someone who looked interesting who'd spoken about money laundering out of South America, and I literally just emailed him. Worked for Homeland Security Investigations, senior investigator. He replied like in half an hour and said, "Yeah, when can you get over?" It's like, you know, I'm trying to look into here a case against Chinese money launderers, ironically enough, considering what I was speaking to Andrew about, brought by the National Crime Agency, concluded successfully, unusually for the National Crime Agency, like 3 years ago, totally finished. And for 9 months, I've been trying to persuade the NCA press officer to tell me anything, like literally anything, even to confirm that it existed beyond the fact of the press release. It's, you know, and that's the difference. There is this reflexive sort of secrecy, which then combined with this, it's just this sort of incompetence in a way. I mean, our court documents, I mean, the difference is amazing. I call up a court in California and say, yeah, there's a court case that happened 18 years ago. Can you find me any documents? And they'll email them to you in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, you can call up the Southwark Crown Court about a case that has literally just happened in this country, and they will deny that it even exists. You know, they've just had. It's just so frustrating and bizarre. And I was just reading one of Michael Lewis's books recently, and he was talking about the chief data officer of the Obama presidency, and the philosophy of the presidency was if something wasn't secret, it should be public. Yeah, which is great. And I was thinking, oh, isn't that amazing? Can you imagine? It's just the sheer baffling sort of wonder of that viewpoint. So anyway, tips for how to investigate this stuff. I mean, there is information, right? I mean, you know, we are good in some ways. Companies House is far more transparent than the US equivalents, so that's good. And obviously, you can find a lot out there, but then, as anyone who spent any time at Companies House will tell you, it's an extremely flawed institution since the information isn't in any way checked. So that's frustrating. But I mean, I find, to be honest, that it's easier to begin at the other end. I find beginning in Ukraine, beginning in Russia, beginning in Angola or Nigeria, and tracing the money back and trying to end up from that end, because you can get much more information there than you can in this country.
I agree. I think that's a really good point. Even in my experiences, I've found that if I'm getting nowhere with the British authorities, which like you is often, I'll think, okay, who's the equivalent in Spain, in France, in Germany, in the US? And more often than not, we'll get the story through coming in through kind of the back door because of the difference in transparency and the willingness of officials to talk to journalists, which is incredible.
There's also an aspect of, I mean, I think that maybe we credit to secrecy what's often just incompetence as well. I mean, one of our investigative bodies, when the invasion of Ukraine happened and there was a sudden big emphasis on oligarchs and what are we going to do about the oligarchs and how are we going to find them and sanction them and punish them badly for what happened and so on. I was invited in to give a briefing to their investigators, which was very happy to do. Obviously, I'm very happy to help anything like this, but I did find myself thinking during the briefing, surely it should be the other way around, right? You know, the investigators are supposed to brief journalists, not journalists brief investigators. It's kind of ridiculous, really. And it's and it is suggestive of a degree of just a lack of capacity, which is very alarming, considering that, you know, we are supposed to be a serious country. That is actually, so part of, a lot of what I write about is inspired by work I've done in Ukraine. I've done a lot of work on corruption in Ukraine. It is a country that combines a very open, dynamic civil society with a very corrupt public sphere, traditionally, which is a great combination, journalistically speaking. And also it's a lovely place and a great place to hang out. And one of the discussions I used to have with friends in Ukraine at length was if something can best be explained by incompetence or corruption. And actually, the more we'd talk about it, the more we'd think that there is a third option, that there is no word for it. In fact, it's such a sort of fuzzy concept, it's quite hard to get your head around, but something which is convenient to a large number of people, but which happened by accident. And I think a lot of the things that happen in Britain to enable financial crime are in that third category. They weren't designed, and they're not. It's not someone screwing up, and it's not someone sort of cackling in a room and rubbing their hands together. It's just crap. And that's, I think, so, you know, the use of, say, Scottish limited partnerships to launder huge quantities of money out of the former Soviet Union, no one designed that. I mean, if they had, no one would be that competent to design such a perfect money laundering vehicle. It was designed, it was intended for agricultural tendencies. It's just some genius money launderer realised that it works just as well for laundering money as it did for, you know, holding Scottish agricultural tendencies, and so it continued. And I think that's the way with a lot of things. It's the same with Gibraltar. You know, no one intended Gibraltar to be, you know, the world's leading centre of offshore gambling services. It's just that it turned out to be part of the same economic space as the UK and to have lower taxes and a very biddable executive, and that was it.
And you've been warning, along with many others, about the issue of Russian money and corrupt money in London and the rest of the UK for years, and the enablers industry that's grown up around it. We've had plenty of warning signs at the poisoning of Alexander Pollicci, Skripal in Salisbury, and every time we've heard... Yeah. And we keep hearing this rhetoric from the government, they're going to do something different this time. We're hearing it with Ukraine now. Why do you think the British government has been so unwilling to tackle money laundering and dirty money flows into the UK for so long?
Obviously we're talking about a lot of governments. We're going back to the 1950s, so there are many different motivations, but I think you can group them into two sort of general areas. One of them is just pure indifference, right? As one politician once said to me, that the issue with corruption is it's everyone's fourth priority. And you know, everyone else has different, top three are different, but you know, no one ever gets to the fourth priority in politics. It just doesn't happen. So that's part of it. But partly, I think a more significant one is if you go back to the origins of the reborn City of London. Obviously, the City of London has a very ancient history. It is, I think, the only political entity that survives from the first millennium. If there's a different one, I don't know what it is. So it is an incredibly ancient thing with a very ancient history, but its rebirth in the 1950s as an offshore financial centre, post-empire, not moving pounds anymore, but moving dollars, you know, working for foreigners rather than British people, and so on, it does depend for its creation and for its continuation on being less well-regulated than other places. That's, you know, the foundation of it is that you could do things in London you couldn't do on Wall Street. And that persists up to this day. And if you look at what happened, for example, with Scottish limited partnerships, there was, particularly after the big Moldovan laundromat, which many of you will remember, it was just $1 billion. But it, you know, it was, I think by the standard of the country where it happened, the biggest bank heist that has ever been. It's about 15% of Moldovan GDP, an incredible amount of money to take from a tiny country. That money ended up in a Scottish limited partnership on Royston Main Street in Edinburgh and then disappeared. And that was a big scandal, and particularly in Scottish politics, made a lot of noise. And so there were serious efforts to change the law around Scottish limited partnerships, which totally failed. In fact, not only did they fail, but the law was further liberalised rather than tightened because of concern that if the law was tightened, it would harm the private fund industry in the UK and that would go to Luxembourg. And we couldn't afford that post-Brexit and so on. So there is a concern that the regulations required to end the movements of illicit money will also end the movement of licit money. And that's That, I mean, that is that's not a conspiracy, because it's what they specifically state when they do their risk assessments and interventions in political debates and so on. From the Treasury that we need to maintain the flows of illicit money, and that's the real challenge with doing anything about dirty Russian money. Is how do you stop that money flowing without also stopping, say, the flow of money from the Gulf? Yeah.
And on that point, in terms of kind of illicit money, corrupt money flowing into the UK, are there any kind of particular industries or areas where this is a particular issue or they're particularly vulnerable to? We could be here a while.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, real estate is the big thing. I found one of the most remarkable demonstrations of the UK approach to real estate was after the sanctions were announced against the big tranches of Russian oligarchs, among them Oleg Deripaska, the big Russian aluminium tycoon. And he has a place, or I think his family has a place, it's not actually his, on Belgrave Square, lovely house. And it got squatted by these 4 anarchists who were they were the most mild-mannered anarchists. And having squatted it, they sat on the balcony with their feet dangling over the edge and sang anarchist songs and occasionally waved for the cameras. They were brilliant in the rain. And there must have been 30 officers from the Met there, including these specialist squads with cherry pickers and harnesses who would raise up the cherry pickers, and then the anarchists would shuffle down the balcony and then they'd have to lower it down and move it. It was brilliant. It's hilarious.
So British.
It was so incompetent. But what was particularly telling about it, and was kind of easy to lose in looking at what was happening, was that 30 Met police officers had responded to 4 anarchists doing essentially nothing to this house apart from sit on the balcony. But none of them, there was no ever any official investigative interest into the origin of the money that bought the house in the first place. This is how much does a house in Belgrave Square cost? £40 million? That is a serious chunk of change coming into central London real estate from a person who had been sanctioned by the United States previously, there have been many allegations made against him, in over many, many years. He's never been convicted of a crime, but still he's a person of interest to Scotland Yard, as they say, you'd hope. And yet there'd never been any concern until some anarchists took over. And that's why, from a real estate perspective, London, I think, is so attractive to oligarchs, because the origin of the wealth that moves into here is never going to be investigated. But if there's any challenge to it, then it's going to be, your wealth will be protected by the full force of Metropolitan Police. So real estate obviously is massive. I'm sure you have many stories about, letters from lawyers acting on behalf of really surprising people.
Oh yes.
So Joe Lowe, who I'm not sure if he's ever been convicted of a crime. I think he's still on the run, but who is accused by the authorities in Singapore and Malaysia and the United States of having masterminded the 1MDB scam, which I think might be the single biggest theft of all time, is it? Just in one go, $4.5 billion.
It's huge.
Yeah, and he denies it. He says he's a political hit. Maybe it is. Who knows? He's never been tried, but he's still someone that you would think that would fail a standard due diligence check. And yet he managed to retain a law firm here to bully everyone, not just publishers, but also anyone who threatened to sell a book, to distribute a book, to list a book on their website, not to do so, which is incredible. When a book about him was finally published, and I wrote an article about the fact it had finally been published for one of our leading newspapers, and they managed to prevent the article being published about the failure of the book to be published. Which is amazing, acting on behalf of a fugitive accused of stealing $4.5 billion. It does suggest that we have a legal industry that's very happy to represent all sorts of people.
And we've heard, of course, from Parliament about a bunch of oligarchs who have sent letters to their lawyers threatening the British government to try and stop themselves being sanctioned, as one example of kind of.
Interestingly, in the last couple of months, I've opened up a interesting channel of communication with a lawyer who I don't know if any of you Game of Thrones fans, but when Arya Stark went to bed at night, she listed the names of all the people she was going to kill, and there was one lawyer who was top of my Arya Stark list for ages, because I made a film about Ukrainian corruption that I was particularly proud of with a Ukrainian friend called Dario Kaleniuk, who's currently in Warsaw, and we were really pleased with it. But anyway, acting on behalf of a particular Ukrainian oligarch, this British law firm managed to destroy the film, and it was never ever screened. And I was really cross about this for years. I literally still am. And then they emailed me in March and said, would I would I speak at an event they were organising about sanctions? And I was like, literally not. Like,
That's the most polite no.
I was like, no. I said, listen, I will speak, but if I do speak, you realise I'm going to talk at some length about what you did to my film. And the guy was like, what are you talking about? And I said, what you did to my film? He's like, I'm sure we didn't do that. And so I just sent him the letter they sent me. I was like, oh well. And then the person who signed the letter, who never responded to me before, invited me out for a coffee, and we had a really interesting chat. She's lovely. But what was really interesting about it was she's not a bad guy in her own eyes. She is representing her clients as well as she can. And it's really interesting talking to her because she comes at the world from a totally different perspective. I think it's really important not to think of the enablers as being like Spectre in the Bond films. They're not sitting around a table discussing how they can mess the world up. That's not how they see things at all. They don't see things. They see me as the bad guy. I'm this nosy Wally who's probing into someone's private affairs, and they're fully within their rights to send a rude letter to prevent this film ever being shown, because how dare I, try and blacken the name of a nice person. And it's, I think, really important to understand, what we call the enabler industry in London, that they don't see themselves as bad people at all. And if you, and I think that's a really important insight into investigating them.
I agree. And one of the points you mentioned there was the sanctions that have been, or we discussed the sanctions that have been imposed a bunch of Russian oligarchs. We've obviously had lots of big promises from the UK government this time to crack down on Russian money, other illicit wealth. I know we've been here before a lot. Yeah. Do you think anything has changed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Things have changed. Obviously, the sanctions have been dramatic and important. It is early days. There are, particularly in the EU, dozens of challenges against the sanctions being brought by wealthy oligarchs that will tie up the EU's legal action service for a long time. It's something really worth keeping an eye on, actually, all those cases. If you look on the European Court list of cases being brought, you can see the surnames of all the people who brought them. It's like a who's who of all the oligarchs you ever heard of.
I'm making a note of this.
Yeah, it's genuinely fascinating, and their relatives. So not just Alisher Usmanov, but both of his sisters, for example, because they've been mentioned too. So it's all the way down. It's really, really interesting. So there will be. The sanctions are not a done deal. There will be challenges, and So that has been interesting. But to be honest, the thing that depresses me about the sanctions is that though they're talked about as a law enforcement mechanism, and we're going to seize the money and give it to the Ukrainians and so on, they're obviously not, because the people who have been sanctioned, they were fine before February. They're the same people with the same money who did the same things, and yet before February they were apparently fine. And all the other people from all the other former Soviet countries or other kleptocracies around the world, they haven't been sanctioned. We're looking at just at Russians. So this is clearly just a Russian issue. So what's far more of interest to me is the legal changes around financial crime and what they mean. And we have had an Economic Crime Act, which passed very quickly, which had some tweaks around various things like unexplained wealth orders, but most importantly, imposed transparency on offshore-owned property. Oligarchs like to own their property via shell companies registered in other jurisdictions like the British Virgin Islands or Seychelles or Cayman or wherever, Delaware, in order to hide their identity. This law is intended to cut through that, to force people to admit who they really are. But, literally 2-3 days ago, Companies House produced a blog post saying that in order to defang this amazing, powerful reform, all you need to do is own the shell company with another shell company. And then all you have to do to declare the beneficial owner is just say who the other shell company is, which is not what we hoped for.
And that's not even taking into consideration enforcement and the policing of Companies House records.
Exactly. So they're, without taking into account the fact that there is no verification of Companies House anyway. We are promising you another economic crime bill, but that was due to come in August. Now they say it'll come in September. Who knows? Let's face it, in January, a government minister resigned because of a lack of action on economic crime. So this is not something in which Boris Johnson sincerely believes. So that is, it is a real issue. So, yes, sanctions have been good. And yes, it was good to get nominally transparency around Companies House, around offshore ownership. But it's pretty shoddy so far, to be honest. And so I don't think there's been a kind of road to Damascus moment when the government has suddenly said, hey, should we have been selling all of these amazing corruption services to Mr. Putin.
So if you were to pinpoint the weaknesses in the government response that you think journalists should be holding to account on or digging into, what would those points be or areas be?
Wow, where to start?
Basically give us stories. Where should we dig into?
The problem is that, and this is something which I'm sure you've come across as well. The problem is that a lot of this is trying to write about negatives. It's some of the best journalists in the world, people like Michael Lewis or Sam Knight or Ed Caesar, people who write really good long form, powerful stuff, often with and people who write about someone doing something amazing. Here is a person you've never heard of who's done this incredible thing. Isn't that amazing? 10,000 words later, you're like, wow, I'm so enlightened by the world. The problem is that there's nothing happening here. Like it's like here is a space that is not full of a person that should be there. How do you tell that story? And that's the challenge. So what is the issue? I mean, I did a book event at a book festival a couple of weeks ago, and someone came up to me afterwards who works for one of our investigative agencies, and I asked them what should I be writing about, and I'm struggling to say they. It was a woman. I can say she. Sorry, I was trying to hide her identity, but I think it's silly. It was all sounding slightly awkward. And she just said, look, and she's practically crying. She just said, look, you've got to understand that we just make it clear that we're trying, And that's the thing is that they are so up against it, all of them up against it, and it's not just in economic crime regulation. I'm writing an article about environmental regulation at the moment as a kind of palate cleanser. The enforcement budget Environment Agency has been cut by 80% in 10 years. 80, not 18. How on earth are you supposed to achieve anything? The amount of prosecutions they've brought is cut from 600 a year to 17. It's as a total hollowing out of the entire regulatory state.
So you're saying funding, backing up all the rhetoric with actual money.
And so, and there's this sort of, any time someone says we need more money, everyone says, yeah, of course you'd say that. But, the director of the National Crime Agency, giving evidence to a parliamentary committee 2 years ago, when asked why she didn't go after oligarchs, said, because I'm concerned about the impact on my budget. That is, a real issue. So, in terms of, how do you turn this into news? I don't know. It's the challenge I face all the time. Is how do you make this fun and not just howling into the void?
Well, that was another point I was going to ask you about. I find that one of the really difficult things when you're writing about financial crime in journalism is to try and make it interesting and not boring and just about numbers and financial flows. And I think one thing you're really good at is telling these stories with a little bit of humour, with a bit of human character in there. And I wondered if you had any advice on how to make stories about financial crime interesting and how you find the human narratives in them.
Yeah, it's the challenge. We did a story together a few years ago about a Belgian dentist whose signature happened to be on, 10,000 companies?
Yeah, something like that.
A lot of the big money laundering structures out of Eastern Europe, his signature was on them. So finding him, that was fun.
That was really fun.
Yeah, so you went to Brussels.
I went to Brussels. We used some of Oliver's Russian language skills, some open source investigations.
And some really shoddy Facebook
security. His wife should not have been on Facebook, put it that way.
One of those people you're like, do not be that person. She was like, we're like, hang on, could she have made it this easy for us?
And she did, we turned up at his door.
It was like sort of the Subbest of sub-Bellingcat investigations.
Yeah, they're literally posting photos of their flat on Facebook. So it's like, we did a great investigative journalism. It was so easy.
She said where she worked. It was amazing.
It was brilliant. But that was a great.
So I did. How do you trying to write about Ukrainian corruption in a way that doesn't? So that I got told by an editor ages ago that this is an interesting story, but it's spinach journalism. And that is
what's spinach journalism?
Spinach journalism is something you should eat.
Oh, that's a great
and it really stuck with me. So my sort of I'd say sort of theoretical basis for the way I try and do journalism is turning spinach into sagaloo. That's what I try and do. Or into spinach quiche or something, or just cream spinach. Something to make it tasty and not a pile of spinach. That's the challenge, right? So there was Ukrainian corruption. I was trying to write about Ukrainian corruption back in 2014 when it was a really important issue in Ukraine, but really struggling to cut through elsewhere. And I happened to notice that the former president had just fled, owned all of his property portfolio and his various companies in Ukraine via a shell company on Harley Street. Right, that's funny. So that's the story. It's Harley Street because it's funny. So it's always the challenge of trying to find the funny detail, and then once you've got the funny detail, you can build around that, like the Belgian dentist, like Harley Street, like whatever. But it's really hard, because this stuff isn't funny. it's awful. And so you do need to be careful not to trivialise what's actually really, really serious. So it is, yeah, it's a challenge. And as I'm sure you come across as well, persuading editors, not only that this is interesting, but it's worth fighting all the lawyers' letters it's a challenge.
100%.
Yeah, the amount of resources that go into just fielding all those bloody letters.
Yeah, I mean, I had a story out recently about a big Tory donor and a Russia-linked donation, and I'm being careful what I say here because I'm aware I'm on camera, but I'm still getting legal letters to this day, and I know that this is about a month ago now, and I know that they sent a ton of legal letters to other media organisations who tried to pick up the story, and it put them off reporting it because it's kind of like, you know, do we have the resources to battle the lawyers of someone very wealthy and powerful.
I have to say, you were asking about things which have changed, which are important. I'd say that actually is one thing that I think has changed in government, is the response to those kind of lawyers is different, and I think that isn't coming. That has come sort of in a way from within the administration, and has got a champion in Dominic Raab. So hopefully there may be legal reforms to prevent the kind of really egregious abuse of the legal process that we've seen a lot of. I mean, I have a friend who works in Angola. It's a little bit better now, but under the previous regime, he was Angola's independent journalism sector. It was him. If he was out of prison, then there was an Angolan independent journalism sector, and if he wasn't, then there wasn't. And he published articles in Portuguese and also in English. And he had a publication in South Africa, a website that ran his material that was really important for getting information about Angolan top-level corruption, which was featuring some really big global players out into the wild. And this website, he was targeted by a British law firm, and he was like, "Well, what are you going to take my kitchen table? But by all means, come at me." And then they targeted that website in Cape Town, and the website was like, "We don't have the resources to deal with this," so they cut him off, and that was it. And he lost his outlet to the world in English, and that is it's a disgrace, really, that it's happening. It was the same with, Daphne Caruana Galizia. It's the same with lots of people exposing really important stuff. So it is good that is getting more attention, and I know that there is a call for evidence and everything happening now. So they will be proposing solutions, and and I know a lot of barristers who work in this world are aware that the system needs to change as well, which is good.
Well, that was a semi-optimistic note to end on for two investigative journalists. That's probably as good as we'll get.
It is heartening. I mean, obviously, normally it turns out to be just as bad as what went before. That's normally what happens. But who knows? Maybe
we might get fewer legal letters.
Maybe we'll get fewer legal letters. Maybe there'll be a space for. Listen, I've got no problem with the kind of Wagatha Christie type. By all means, I think that adds to the gaiety of the nation. But I do have a problem with the fact that you can't even write an article about the fact that someone couldn't write a book about Joe Low. That's going too far. It's quite entertaining. I'm going to briefly name drop because it amuses me. I was in the pub the other day on a Friday night, and I got called up by The World Tonight saying that they wanted to do a thing about the British Virgin Islands, and would I go on and talk about it? And because they knew I'd written a chapter about it in the book. And I was like, sure. And they said, "Oh, we're really struggling to find anyone in the BVI to talk to. No one will talk to us." And I said, "Oh, well, I'll send you a contact for this guy. He's really nice. I'm sure he'll talk to you. He's a really thoughtful guy." So I sent them their phone number and didn't think anything of it. And then I was on together with him, and they said, "And now we've got the acting premier of the BVI." I was like, "No way." He was like, "Oh, my friend got made acting premier." so that was nice, and actually really hopeful because he's an honest person, which is good. So hopefully that is good. But anyway, going back to your question, I think that the opening up of the registry in the BVI and elsewhere, obviously, but the BVI is the big one. I mean, in terms of British overseas territories, the big incorporation haven has always been the BVI. It is important and significant, but because of the fact that happened, a lot of the people who would have incorporated in the BVI no longer incorporate there already. I mean, the movement has already happened. If you look at incorporation rates, they've dropped by half, more than half, haven't they? So part of the issue, I think, why Andrew Fahy and other people are accused of getting involved with the cartels. Obviously, I don't know whether he was, but I had heard a lot of rumours that the cartels were very active in the BVI. And as I understand it from contacts on the ground, that the problem is that the money that was coming in to all the law firms to incorporate all the companies is dried up. So basically, the elite were looking for new ways of making a living. So I think, in a way, Britain is slightly to blame for what happened, because it was this idea of the just transition for fossil fuel countries. You needed a just transition for a tax haven, because if you want, these are people who are very skilled in financial affairs. If you want them not to just immediately engage in moving money around for the cartels, you do actually need to give them something else to do. Yeah, yes. I mean, obviously a number of conditionals on the way to that outcome, like the competent and the being seized and everything. I mean, these are all, difficult. And there have been, for example, even in the States, for example, they jailed a former Prime Minister of Ukraine, Pavlo Lazarenko, in I think 2001, 2002. They still haven't managed to seize his assets. This stuff is really well protected. But if they do, and if powers are brought in to allow them to seize the mansions in Knightsbridge and so on, and to use that money and to send it back, then it's obviously really important not to just immediately send it to corrupt actors who are going to send it straight back and buy more mansions in Knightsbridge. It's a problem that the US had with the Obiangs in Equatorial Guinea. They confiscated some assets, and then, the whole country belongs to the president and his son. So what do you do with the money you've just seized from the president and his son? It's a challenge. But there are models that have worked. In Kazakhstan, there was money seized from the Nazarbayev family in Switzerland, which was then repatriated to a number of small NGOs doing sort of reproductive health and things like that, and that was quite successful as a program. Obviously, it's a difficult thing to impose, because it's sort of infringing on the sovereignty of the nation that you're sending the money back to, but it can be done. I would say in Ukraine, if we're taking the money from Russian oligarchs to help Ukraine, there's going to be no shortage of easy ways to spend the money. I mean, there's so much infrastructure that will need to be rebuilt, and so and all that. So fields that will need demining and things. So in that case, it's going to be relatively easy. The challenge is what you do in somewhere like Nigeria. There's been cases when money was sent back by Liechtenstein to Liberia and then just disappeared to Nigeria, not Liberia. So it is a real challenge. I always think that the focus should not be so much on seizing money that's already been stolen, but on preventing more money being stolen. Once you've sort of built the dam, you can worry about what's the other side of it, but you need to stop it leaking first, because otherwise the money just keeps flowing through all the time. And that's what I would love to see more focus on mending the defences to prevent dirty money coming into our financial system at all. But the BBC. Just in the UK. No, I'm going to do it just in the UK, because otherwise 10 billion wouldn't go far enough. Obviously a lot more money. So one is Companies House reform. So we've got a proper, and with enough resources to check the information of the companies that get sent there. A lot of that can be done with AI, but you need to have resources to set up the AI engines in the first place. And then a properly well-resourced National Crime Agency and a serious fraud office. And then I would split territorial policing, all of the anti-fraud aspect of territorial policing I would take away from the territorial police forces and create, like you have British Transport Police, a British Financial Crime Police, to look at the lower level, the common or garden frauds that aren't going to interest the National Crime Agency, but will take 30, 40 grand from someone and ruin their lives. So that's what I would do. But with regard to what you're saying about the compliance issue, I couldn't agree more. The problem is that there are some very, very strict requirements for firms to comply with all these regulations, but there's no actual sort of punishment if they don't, in a way. So it's just essentially a tax on the good guys and not really an impediment for the bad guys. In that if you voluntarily don't do this business, you don't get the business, and if you do the business, there's no downside. Occasionally, thanks to something like the Pandora Papers or hopefully whatever it is you're doing now, these people are exposed, and there is a kind of a degree of pushback, if only from like the Solicitors Regulatory Authority or whatever, but very little. Even in that case, the fines are pretty minimal.
It also doesn't address the issue at the other end of the spectrum, right? Once these banks or wherever have, fulfilled their responsibilities, submitted the SARs, the Know Your Customer documents, what then happens at the other end? And from all the reporting I've done, the NCA unit that deals with it's massively under-resourced, massively overwhelmed. They get 500,000 of these SARs every year. They can prioritise a certain amount. Corruption, it's not even one of the prioritised categories. It's things like whether it's a human victim, fraud, trafficking, but in terms of financial crime, corruption, it's not priorities. Some of these don't even get looked at. So even if you've got these banks, law firms, fulfilling those obligations, it doesn't help you if there's no one at the other end policing them.
It's easy. I don't want to be rude about the National Crime Agency because they are trying really hard. They've got good people, but it's really hard if you're working for an organisation like that, and it's quite clear no one in politics cares about what you're doing. You just get criticised, and after you've been trained up for 2 or 3 years, you can just walk into a job in compliance for HSBC or whoever and double, triple your salary just like that, without any risks at all, because all the risks are being dumped back on the National Crime Agency as soon as they've filed a suspicious activity report. So it's not surprising that they just go there, use it as a training ground, and then go into the city, because why wouldn't you? Just as a sign of what the political priorities were, the International Corruption Unit, which has existed for quite a long time, which was funded out of the development budget, but it differed when differed still existed, it was looking at international corruption, but it was looking at it in countries with whom Britain had an aid relationship, so Pakistan, Nigeria, Malawi, places like that. And you can tell, obviously, that the motivation there is terror that the Daily Mail will find out that some of our aid budget has been stolen by a politician and spent on a football club. That's the terror. It's not worrying about whether Putin's going to invade Georgia or Ukraine again. It's just, we mustn't be on the front page of the Daily Mail. That's and as long as that is the political driver behind it, then you're never going to get anywhere. I remember meeting sources. It's all about Zoom these days. I did once. I was working on a story ages ago that never got published thanks to legal reasons, so that's a different threat. But they did suggest meeting. They were Ukrainians and with no connection to Italy, but they did suggest meeting in Milan. And I'm afraid I decided to turn them down. I thought that was a step too far. In general, I think I'm probably not something they care about, so I just go about my business. I don't normally worry very much. Digitally, I do all what you'd think, right? I use Signal and I use all the 2-stage verification and all that stuff. But generally speaking, I think if the Russians are going to hack me, they're going to hack me. I'm not GCHQ, and nor am I interested in being GCHQ. So, if it's something I don't want anyone reading, I have it on paper. In terms of data subject access requests and all that kind of nonsense, like not having it in digital form is quite good anyway.
This was an issue, actually, my team had to address when I was at BuzzFeed, and we did a series looking at suspected Russian assassinations in the UK.
Very good series.
And
there's a TV series about it.
This is great. We're just getting cross promotion here. Sorry, everyone. But yeah, this was the first investigation I'd done, where it wasn't just about kind of the fear wasn't just legal threats, right? It was actually our physical safety, and that was probably less to do with the fear of the Russian intelligence services and more to do with the Russian mafia, because our story kind of crossed both sides. So for us, we did have weird things happening to some of us. Ended up with cars parked outside our house for days on end. Others, one of my colleagues walked into his flat and there was a bottle balanced on 5 books that had been left there. And the issue, they were all trying to strike kind of fear in us rather than, they wanted us to know they were kind of watching us rather than anything more covert. But for us, a couple of things we use. One, whenever we went out on kind of doorsteps or to meet kind of a potentially dodgy or risky source, if we didn't have a colleague nearby, we would have on a location tracking app with all of us shared on. We use WhatsApp to update each other with where we were and when, and once we were clear of the meeting. And we also, like Oliver said, we either use Signal, or to be honest, we kept a lot of it on a burner laptop, which wasn't connected to any Wi-Fi or anything like that. And we didn't have anything on Google Docs or anything like that. So yeah, those were kind of some of the tips I picked up there. But that's a one and only story, kind of we've ever had to face kind of any physical safety threats, and it's nothing. Like, everyone would ask if you're scared, and it's kind of like, well, it's nothing compared with what Ukrainian, Russian journalists face who are doing our jobs.
So there's a Luke Harding book about being intimidated by the FSB in Moscow, and I read that, which is he's a very fun writer. It's a very easy read considering how grim the subject matter is. But what was quite funny is reading it, I was like, oh yeah, that happened to me.
Yeah, same. I did exactly the same.
And I was like reading all this, like, and I'd, it's like they'd gone into the flat had been ransacked, whatever, and I was like, oh, so was ours. I just assumed that my flatmate left the door open, or like, we were like the worst people to intimidate because we were both so utterly useless. So it was like, if there'd been a bottle balanced on a book, I just think Simon had decided to create some random sculpture. That was it.
You need the balance of that. I think journalists in our field can be overly paranoid.
Yeah, we were definitely in the wrong direction. I mean, we always had random friends staying anyway, so it was like, well, whatever. It's actually really interesting. I should know this and I don't. I don't know if our legislation allows them to be challenged in the same way. I think it probably does. I mean, in the US, I don't think you can. I think in the US, if you get sanctioned, you get sanctioned, and you just got to suck it up. In the EU, you can challenge it, and there have been a lot of oligarchs who've had a lot of success in getting off the lists, though occasionally they're just added straight back again. I imagine in the UK, I assume we sort of copied our EU type list, so presumably they'd be doing the same thing here. But yeah, we don't have the same degree of helpful transparency. I mean, the EU one kind of only goes so far since they only say the surname of the person challenging. So a lot of the surnames are very distinctive, but some of them say the surname Khan, Khan. I mean, that is a very common surname in many parts of the world. There is a Russian oligarch called German Khan. I assume it's him. But it could be a Khan from another part of the world. So it's not really clear. So it's not a perfectly transparent list, but it's a lot better than what we have. I do think there's a very interesting question about how they're being maintained, who's looking after them, who's in them. Because these people, their bank accounts are frozen. They presumably don't have, the money to water the window boxes, to hoover the carpets, to all these things. I mean, to pay the electricity bills. What's actually happening? I don't know. I mean, it's a really interesting question, actually. These are. Some of them. I don't actually know whether Guriev. Annoyingly, Alexander Guriev, who owns Wittenhurst, I think it's called Alexander, the biggest house after Andrei is it. He has the same name as his son, and there is an Andrei Guriev sanction, but I don't know which one it is. And they both. Well, there you go, Wittenhurst, the biggest house after Buckingham Palace. That takes a lot of maintaining. What happens? That's an interesting question. Do you have any thoughts on that BBC piece on KSL?
We had a conversation about this off the record. We're on camera, so I have no thoughts on that piece.
I didn't read it.
It was an access journalism.
It was a disappointing piece of journalism, I would say, in that we didn't learn anything about KSL, how many people it has, what its budget is, whether it's a new budget, whether it's a reallocation of an old budget, if it has any new powers. And it also reported that it wasn't really looking to prosecute anyone, just kind of annoy them. And that didn't seem legal to me. Like a law enforcement agency shouldn't just be in the business of harassing people. So it was an odd piece of journalism, I thought, a slight disappointment. So I didn't teach as much about KSAL, apart from the fact that it had been renamed KSAL from the kleptocracy cell.
Completely different unit. I think that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid.
Jane's up next, by the way.
I can talk, but this is a lot of talking even for me, so I'm going to have a little break. But thank you all, they were all great questions. And
really
thanks for listening.
Thank you.